Hello, Bible Geeks. Ryan Schumacher here again. We're here on week 3 of our series on the Old Testament in today's world. And we're going through the theology of the Old Testament and seeing what we can take away from that for our lives today into the Christian faith. And so our third one here is going to be on covenants, and specifically I'm calling it covenants and the promises of God, because on this one, we're going to be focusing mainly on the promissory covenant. So there's another covenant, the Sinai covenant, which actually is not promissory, and we're going to go into that next week when we look at the theology of the law. But here today, our focus is going to be on what is a covenant, so we're going to talk about that definition. We're then going to talk about the promises of God that are in the Old Testament that we can see from the covenants. The covenants are some of the most important markers in the Old Testament. If you want to have anchors for Old Testament theology, you need to understand what the covenants are, so the different covenants that are there, what the terms of those covenants are. And if you get that, you're going to be able to see things pop up throughout the Old Testament. It is really one of the most effective ways to have a richer reading of the Old Testament. So there's particular passages that you should study really well, get to know them very well. And if you do that, you're going to be able to get the theology of the Old Testament a whole lot better. And then, so we're going to go over the promises, and then we're going to go over why in particular did God use covenants when dealing with humans? Why this particular vehicle? So I want to start off with a definition of a covenant, and it's going to be a very detailed definition, and I'm going to walk through each part of it. So this is from Dr. Dan Lane, his PhD dissertation in May 2000, Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. Who just, why such an obscure reference, Ryan? He was my Old Testament professor and was really big on the covenants because he wrote his dissertation on it. So, Dan Lane's definition: a lifelong, unchangeable, solemn agreement between two designated parties in which one or both make an oath-bound pledge to the other to perform a specified commitment or else suffer the wrath of God. So that's the definition. You can see in here, there's a lot of different components. So this lifelong, unchangeable, solemn, binding agreement. So if we just walk through this lifelong, so something to know about the covenants, and this is true of ancient Near Eastern covenants, this definition is not just a definition of biblical covenants. This is going to be true of, I would say, any covenant, but probably think of this as ancient Near Eastern in terms of its setting. So lifelong means that it is in force as long as the parties are alive, but it also doesn't transfer from party to party. So this is going to be as long as like King A and King B are alive, this covenant is in force, and then when King B dies, there's no more covenant, even if King B's son comes to the throne. The King B's son does not inherit his father's covenant. Okay, unchangeable. In the words of the genie from Aladdin, no substitutions, extensions, or refunds. This is once that covenant is put in force, that is the binding. Those are the binding rules. You're not changing them. So solemn, these are not flippant. They're not entered into lightly. You can kind of see that a little bit from lifelong and unchangeable. I mean, that's a pretty big commitment. And then a binding agreement. So to make something binding, I mean, you can't actually stop anybody from violating the covenant. There's no mechanism to make it like once we enter into this covenant, it is physically impossible that the covenant be broken. By binding, it means that there's an or else attached to it. So it's not like the UN resolution, which is just everybody saying, wouldn't it be nice if we did this? Or you might even hear some governmental agencies passing what are called non-binding resolutions. This is binding. There is an or else attached to it. So two designated parties, we actually discussed this already because I got ahead of myself. It's not transferred to successors, in which one or both make an oath-bound pledge. So the center of the covenant is the oath-bound pledge. So it's a pledge for an ongoing commitment, and it's sealed with an oath. And so that sealing it with an oath is what makes it solemn and binding, and the nature of this thing is lifelong or unchangeable. And then at the end here, or else suffer the wrath of God. So there's a divine witness and the idea of even divine enforcement coming in on a covenant. So those are the features of this definition. It's around forever. It doesn't change. This is serious stuff. It's binding. There's an or else. It's between two designated parties, so nobody else. And if that specified commitment is broken, then God is the offended party's witness. Bad stuff's going to happen to you. All right, so that's the definition. Fundamentally, a covenant is a form of an agreement. So it represents a new stage in the relationship. So a king may have a trade agreement with another king, but when they choose to enter into a covenantal situation, this is a big deal. This is a real pledge and commitment between these two tribes. Covenants also are entered into by choice. If it's imposed, it ain't a covenant. That's not how covenants work. Now, caveat that. To be sure, in the ancient Near East, and you could say even to some extent today, covenants were kind of, you could enter into a covenant with me, or I could utterly destroy your city. So, are these completely free choices? Are these things that you would say are always, clear-minded with an option to enter the covenant or not to enter the covenant? I mean, technically, yes. Realistically, you can choose to surrender, you could choose not to surrender. But if somebody's got your city surrounded, and the Romans had a particular penchant for this, they'd surround your city and say, look, it's over. We can destroy you. How about this? You become a protector to the Roman Empire, and you're going to send us taxes, and it's all going to be good. And we are going to be able to come in and enforce the collection of taxes. Roman military is going to keep order, but all y'all can do whatever the heck you want aside from that. Just pay us taxes and be loyal to the emperor. And so it is technically a choice, but yes, sometimes there was duress involved. Now, in the Bible, we don't see that. There's no evidence of negotiation of a covenant. These were all take it or leave it offers. There was also, I wouldn't say, any imposition on that. They are fundamentally agreements. So, even when there was a covenant made with Abraham, he wasn't magically transported. Abraham had to go. When God said, I would make you my treasured possession and a royal priesthood, the Israelites at Sinai said, all that you have said we will do and obey. They didn't have to say that. David could have refused to have a son. It's possible. Or refused to have further children. So there is interplay between the two parties. So here's a question, just this idea of covenant. So what is the closest modern thing to a covenant? What is the closest thing to a modern covenant? I think I like my verbal phrasing better. What is the closest modern thing to a covenant? Something we can think of. This, of course, would be what we refer to as the covenant of marriage. So marriage is lifelong. So even in the vows, as long as we both shall live, as opposed to something that's like a contract when the work is done, or I no longer want to work here. So it has that lifelong nature to it. It's unchangeable. So, in the traditional wedding vows, for better or for worse, richer or poorer, sickness or in health, as long as we both shall live. There's not, provisions for amending the marriage contract. It's like no matter what happens, this covenant will stay in place. We refer to these things as the marriage vows, which is another way of talking about an oath-bound pledge. This is not a handshake agreement or some sort of provisional idea. There is the vow, the solemn vow that's at the middle of it. And I was going to suffer the wrath of God. Okay, this probably wasn't in either your marriage vows or the mortgage contract. So not all covenants are the same. But this is the closest thing that we would see in our daily lives to a covenant. That would be marriage. So in the Bible and in the ancient Near East, you're going to have three different kinds of covenants. So not all covenants are the same. So just because I've made that analogy to marriage, I guess the reason that I bring that up before we go into this is because we think in terms of contracts for the most part. There are very few things in our modern life that are quite like marriage in the way that we think about it. So now there's you could even say, well, not all marriages last a lifetime. That's true, and not all covenants lasted. But when a party breached the covenant, then you would have conditions for what happens in the breach of the covenant: blessings for obedience, curses for disobedience. And in the ancient Near East, if you breach the covenant really bad, the full extent of the covenant curses usually would be the annihilation of the party that violated the covenant. So, the provision for divorce even doesn't annul the fact that this is supposed to be a covenant, because the agreement itself is intended to be a lifelong agreement. So, but that's just one type of covenant. There are a few different kinds of covenants that we see. So one of them, and the one that appears most often in the Bible, is called a promissory covenant. This is when a stronger party freely grants a benefit on a weaker party. It's known as a royal grant, or in particular, you would see this most commonly as a land grant. So kind of a land grant covenant where one party would give another party land for forever and ever and ever, amen. There are some in the ancient Near East, you don't find any examples of this in the Bible, but there are some that are, you call them parity covenants. There are two parties that are agreeing to a mutually balanced solemn obligation. This might be a trade covenant. So more than just an agreement, but a in perpetuity kind of idea. And then the vassal covenant, this one might be the most popular in the ancient Near East, is when a stronger party imposes solemn obligations onto a weaker party. So also known as a suzerain vassal treaty, suzerain being the superior party, vassal being the lesser party. And so this one would be like that Roman situation I described, or you saw this with the Assyrians and the Babylonians, what they were intending to do to the Israelites. You have basically, you are going to pay us tribute, and you are going to be our, a satellite city-state for us. And if you don't pay us tribute, then we'll blow you up. But the upside of the covenant was you still got to have your city, and you didn't get destroyed. So these suzerain vassal treaties were often kind of things that came out of terms of surrender in military conflict. Those wouldn't be the only circumstances, but the majority circumstance. So those are the three kinds of treaties. There's like the land grant, the royal grant, the promissory, parity, and then the vassal covenants. All right. Ancient covenants, then, they were ratified, another word for adopted, with a ritual that conveyed their seriousness and solemnity. And then usually it would be followed by a shared meal. But, you'd have the kings sort of come together, and they would do this ceremony. It often involved animal sacrifice, where you would take the animals and you would split them in two. And you would have them kind of off to the side, and there would be a lane down the middle. And then the parties would walk through on either side of the slain animals. On the lane in the middle with the slain animals on the side of them. And ancient documents attest that the purpose of this was to basically convey, if either of us breaks the covenant, then let what has happened to these animals happen to us. It is a statement of that a covenant is deadly serious, if you will. Not flippant, but solemn. And then they would end up usually, if it was like two clans that would do this, they would have a shared meal together of the animals that were used as part of the covenant ritual. Okay, so covenants in the Bible. So this is going to be for class tomorrow. Take a moment right now, pause the video if you'd like, and see if you can name some of the covenants that are in the Bible. All right, if you've given yourself time to try and name them, let's go through. So the first one you're going to find is in Noah, the Noahic Covenant, Genesis 9. This is probably the one you're least likely to have remembered, because the Noahic Covenant doesn't really play much of a role in the rest of the Bible like the other covenants do, which are very specific and very important. Covenant with Abraham, one of the most important ones. This is sort of the foundation of the faith of Israel. found in Genesis 12, 15, 17. You could even go to the sacrifice of Isaac a little bit later as part of that as well. But 12, 15, and 17, you have the initial blessings, kind of the terms of the covenant laid out in Genesis 12. You have the ratification ceremony in Genesis 15, and then you have the description of the sign of the covenant, circumcision, in Genesis 17. The Sinai covenant, so Exodus 19 and 20, this includes the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments. Covenant with David, then 2 Samuel 7, and then finally the new covenant, which is described in the Gospels. And since we're going to be talking about Old Testament theology, the context of the new covenant will be out of scope for this particular discussion because I only have so much time, and we said it's about the Old Testament. Now, one of these is another fun one. One of these is not like the others. Can you pick it out? Do you know which one it is? I've actually already said it on the video so far. But that would be the Sinai covenant. So the Sinai covenant is a vassal treaty. All the others are promissory covenants. And so we'll get into the different nature of the Sinai vassal treaty next week when we're talking about the law. But for now, I just want to focus on the 3 promissory covenants of the Old Testament to describe how God's promises are illustrated and brought out through the promissory covenants of the Old Testament. So what are those promises that we can solemnly hold God to? So we're going to go through each of those covenants right now. So we're going to start with the Noahic covenant. So from Genesis 9, I'm going to go ahead and read here. So then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, "As for me, I am establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you." Okay, if God says I'm establishing a covenant, then it's a covenant. "And with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the domestic animals, and every animal of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. I establish my covenant with you that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth." God said, "This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the water shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh." Okay, so there's a few things that we can see through here. It's very specific in the named parties, right? So the covenant is between me, Yahweh, and then you, Noah, and your descendants after you, and every living creature. So this is a covenant between God and all creation. Now, we can see also a lot of that repetition. So, and in fact, I cut off some of the repetition. It goes on a little bit more, but it's very clear what the nature of the covenant is. And there's a sign of the covenant. So there won't be a flood, the earth won't be destroyed, and the rainbow is the sign of that. So, the specific promissory covenant of God, he will not flood the earth again to destroy the earth. That's the covenant with Noah and his descendants. Now, is there any condition upon Noah and his descendants in this covenant? Was there an if? Was there a subjunctive? No, there was not. It was all just, I am making a covenant with you. I am making a lifelong, unchangeable, solemn binding oath between me and you that says, I will not flood the earth again to destroy the earth. And does it say the promise will expire one day? No. And since covenants are lifelong, is God going to die? No. So this is an eternal covenant. I want to have 2 theological indulgences before we go on. Not those kinds of indulgences. Those came many thousands of years later. But if you would indulge me on a couple theological points on the Noahic covenant. First of all, so God used the great flood to destroy the earth, or at least, perhaps the ground that what constituted the earth was not destroyed, but essentially all the living creatures, everything except for Noah and the ark. So when was the last time water covered the whole earth? It's in the Bible. And that, of course, is the second verse of Genesis. The wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Remember, we talked about this last week with Genesis, how there was nothing but water was there at the very beginning. And then God creates a separation in the waters with the dome, and then the waters pull back and there's land. But the primordial waters the symbols of chaos that show up in the ancient Near Eastern creation stories all throughout. So this is, in a way, it's a return to pre-creation when God floods the world. God was, in a way, starting over. And if you want more evidence of that, what command is given to Noah a little bit later? Noah was told to be fruitful and multiply, just like Adam and Eve. So with this recreation, this starting over, there's a question. And the question is going to be, are the rules of engagement for humanity the same? Or is there going to be a new rule? But there won't be. Noah's family is given the same charge as Adam and Eve, that they are supposed to essentially work in the garden along with God. So here's the other point I want to pick up too. God hangs his bow in the sky. So he says, behold, I'm putting my bow in the sky, and it's the rainbow. Now, what is a bow? Specifically like an arced bow like this. What are bows used for? Bows, of course, especially at that time, if you have to think about it, bows are what? They're weapons. Bows, bow and arrow. Use that for archery. Look, I'm not going to say that I know this to be true, but this is hard to avoid as an observation. It looks to me like with God saying, I will not flood the earth to destroy the earth or all flesh on earth again. Here is my bow hanging up in the sky. I think God is hanging up his weapon, so to speak. And in particular, and work with me on this, I think that God is saying that the problem of human sinfulness is not going to be handled by the outpouring of God's wrath. I think that's the significance of the Noahic covenant. Because what started the whole thing? God saw that, the heart of man was wicked and it was only evil continually, and God repented that he had made him. God was very sad that we are very bad. And so what did God do? Flood the earth. I'm going to save the one good dude and his family that I can find, and we'll get all the animals on there so we don't lose any of the cool creation. And then recreation, return to chaos, and then the waters ebb back, the land is there, the first people are brought out, they're given the same charge, and then the promise is that I'm not going to do that again. The problem of human sinfulness, which is what the flood was the response to. The flood was responding to human sinfulness. That problem, God says, will not be through destruction. It will not be through an outpouring of wrath. It is going to have to be solved some other way. And I think there's something theologically important for us in there too. The problem of sinfulness in our lives, in the world, whatnot, it's not going to be dealt with bombs and guns. It has to be dealt with through the way that Jesus gave us, through the way of this different way of life that doesn't wield power violently like that. So I think that's the specific purpose of the Noahic covenant. Okay, so this is what I'm calling promise number 1. God will never again flood the earth. Creation will not be undone. Human sin won't be solved by wrath and destruction. So theologically, I think this is the first promise of God that we can extract from Old Testament theology that's exposed through the covenants. All right? So let's go on to the next one here. We have the Abrahamic Covenant. So this begins in Genesis chapter 12, verse 1. So then Yahweh said to Abram, "Go out from your land, your relatives, and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who treat you with contempt, and all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So these are the terms of the covenant that are being initially described and brought to Abram. As 21st century people, something like this happened. Would this seem completely fantastical to us? I think so. I can't rule out that some of you may feel like something has happened like this to you, where God has spoken to you like that, told you to go, maybe leave where you were and go to where you're being told to go. But I think for most people, at least in 21st century North America and in Europe, this would seem pretty out of the ordinary. Now, here's a question we should ask ourselves. How would an ancient Near Eastern person interpret this situation? Are you ready? Probably would go something like this. Wow, I found favor with one of the gods. My family now has a clan god that's going to sponsor us. The idea of a god that was specific to your family was not totally out of the ordinary. Was this special? Sure. And were these promises significant? Yes. I mean, the familial promise to somebody who had no children would be very significant. Given that Sarah was unable to have children, Abram would have believed that a god could do something about this. So, the idea that Sarah was barren and then could become unbarren because one of the gods found favor upon him, totally easy to believe, and this is a great break that just came our way. Land also. The land promise is really important in the ancient Near East. Land is livelihood. It's a promise of sustenance for you, the security of your offspring. It's your identity. If you had land, you could grow crops. If you had land, there's a place where you belonged. If you had land, then there would be places for your children to live, and for their children to live. Like that land was security for the future. As we'll see, the land also becomes a way for God to dwell with his people, but that's not really in view just yet. And so without land, it's hard to imagine how this could possibly happen. Land was sort of, if God was going to make him a great nation, of course there was going to have to be land. It could be no other way. So that had to be part of the promise. Here's the thing I want to get across. Yahweh appeared to Abram in a way that Abram would understand. This wasn't a completely fantastic experience for an ancient Near Eastern person, though it was special. But many families had clans and personal gods. It was a privilege, but it was nonetheless consistent with his ancient Near Eastern thinking and belief. And notice here too, and I'll say this again later, God is not starting with law or commandments. God is starting with a relationship. So this initial revelation to Abram is something that, yes, was a privilege, but was not completely unheard of, unique in ancient Near Eastern history as far as he or anybody else that he'd be working with would be concerned. He now had a clan god for him and his family. All right. So what were these promises? So there was the go, and then there was the I will. So go, leave the land that you know. Leave your family, go to where I, Yahweh, will show you, and I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. You can see kind of the repetitive structure here. So I will make you great, bless you, make your name great, you will be a blessing. And then through you, all peoples will be blessed. So God doesn't start with that law. God starts with this relationship, that trust me. That's basically the very first thing. There's not, if you do this, then I will do that. This is not a quid pro quo kind of contract. This is enter into this by choice. Trust me, and I will grant these things to you. So you're seeing a promissory covenant again, that the greater party is promising something to the lesser party. Also, I will make your name great. I'm going to give you bonus points. This contrasts with another part earlier in Genesis. Do you know which one that is? So I will make your name great. There were people who said that they wanted to make a name for themselves. And it was in the chapter just before this. And they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the sky. Let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we would be scattered over the face of the whole earth. This is the Tower of Babel story. So the Tower of Babel, humans are saying, let us make a name for ourselves. And then God comes in saying, God knocks down the Tower of Babel, and then God says, I will make your name great. This is how it's going to happen. It's going to come through Abram, and who will become Abraham. So that's just a really interesting contrast there. These stories are woven together, and they're much more clever than we give them credit for, I think. Okay, so then we get to part 2. This is where the covenant is actually going to be ratified. So in chapter 15, verse 1, God is talking to Abraham again. He says, your reward will be great. And Abram's like, all right, so when's the whole offspring thing going to start? I ain't getting any younger over here. This is when he's, decades into his life. And he says, "A slave born in my house will be my heir." Something here in the ancient Near East, sometimes elderly people without children would adopt an adult to then become their child. And in exchange, that adult who was adopted, the slave in the household, would become the heir, the son, to whom the estate would go. So Abram seems to think this is what's going to become of him. Yahweh, you moved me out here. You promised me this thing. It ain't happening. And so now a slave is going to end up being my heir. I'm going to have to adopt. Yahweh then makes a unilateral promise that Abram's descendants will be as numerous as the stars. And Abram asks, "How will I know?" And God responds with a covenant, with a lifelong, unchangeable, solemn, binding agreement between two parties that refers to a specific ongoing commitment. That is how God responds. So there's a covenant ratification ceremony. There's no new promises here, but this is the guarantee. And this is unparalleled in the ancient Near East. The idea that there are gods that are making covenants with humans doesn't happen. So there were the terms that were described in Genesis 12. Those were promises, but this is the covenant. And a covenantal promise between God and humans is just not something that happens with any frequency. So then there's the part where Yahweh has to bring the animals and they cut them in two and they're separated, just like a covenant ceremony. So what's done with the animals then matches that covenant ceremony we talked about. These are deadly serious, as I mentioned before. And remember, only God has made promises to Abram at this point. God is swearing by his own necessary existence that these things will happen. And you might remember, only God passes through the animals at that point. We get this, we get the smoking fire pot and the flaming torch. What does that sound like? A pillar of fire. Who comes as a pillar of fire? This, of course, resembles the Shekinah glory. This resembles the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night that led them through the desert. This is, Isaiah 6, Exodus 19, Exodus chapter 40. The idea that God himself is passing through. Abram probably would have been familiar with this. These kinds of implements were parts of ceremonies for some of the gods, the sun god or fire gods in ancient religion. So Abram also would have understood this, not the way that we might with, the Shekinah or whatever. That was way, way off. But in the idiom of the time, these were symbols for the gods. And so that God is passing through and taking the oath of the covenant upon himself. So the answer, how will I know? God responding with a covenant ratification ceremony where he passes through, and only he, which means only he's taking the oath, saying this is what will happen. That is the promise of God. And then everything else coming through it. You will have descendants. They will be as numerous as the stars. I will make your name great, make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and through you all the nations on earth will be blessed. That is sealed by God's ratification ceremony there in Genesis 15. So promise number 2, through the line of Abraham, the whole world will receive blessing. This people has been chosen to be his vessel for revelation and for renewal to the world. So all people will be blessed through Abraham. And that blessing, what we see here is the revelation of God coming through these people and then going out into the world. This, ultimately culminates in the New Testament, where the gospel is now given to Christians and go out into the world and make disciples of every nation. See, go in the world, make disciples of every nation, and know that I'm with you even to the end of the age. God will be with them, dwelling with them, and that comes through the Holy Spirit in Pentecost. But they are to go out into the world and make disciples of every nation. That harkens back to Abraham. All right, third promissory covenant, the Davidic Covenant. The covenant with David is found in 2 Samuel 7. There's a little whimsical thing I have right here called Praise for 2 Samuel 7. You see this on books, like new books that come out that say praise for this title. there's some quotes in here that are pretty dramatic from people about 2 Samuel 7. So Ron Youngblood, credentials there, says this is the center and focus of the Deuteronomic history itself, which is a pretty big statement. The most crucial theological statement in the Old Testament, Walter Brueggemann. And then finally, the ideological summit of the Old Testament, the title deed of the Davidic house to rule over Israel and Judah. So if you're unfamiliar with 2 Samuel 7, this is one to know. It's one to spend some time in, and we'll spend some time there right now. So 2 Samuel 7, verses 1 through 3. In fact, you know what? Maybe I will just pull that up and read real quick. We'll read through this. So 2 Samuel 7, here we go. So now when the king was settled in his house, and the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies around him, the king here is David, the king said to the prophet Nathan, "See now, I'm living in a house of cedar, but the ark of God stays in a tent." Nathan said to the king, "Go do that all of you have in mind, for the Lord is with you." So David wants to build a temple for God. So David's like, I'm living in this beautiful house. God's in a tent. The ark had just come back to Jerusalem, so it's not like it's been there forever. Like, the ark comes back, and then David's like, this isn't going to work. And so Nathan then gives David the green light. And then coming right after that, God picks up the phone and calls Nathan right away to straighten this out. And so verse 4, that same night the word of the Lord came to Nathan. "Go and tell my servant David, thus says the Lord, are you the one to build me a house to live in? I have not lived in a house since the day I brought the people of Israel from Egypt to this day, but I have been moving about in a tent and a tabernacle. Wherever I have moved among all of the people of Israel, did I ever speak a word with any of the tribal leaders of Israel, whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, saying, why have you not built me a house of cedar?" So God goes to Nathan. Nathan says, "Can you go tell David, I have not demanded a house. Why are you trying to build this massive temple for me?" And so then we get the covenant promises, which come right after that. And so we have in verse 8, "Now therefore thus you shall say to my servant David, thus says the Lord of hosts, the Lord of heaven's armies," NLT translation, "I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep, to be prince over my people Israel. And I have been with you wherever you went, and have cut off all your enemies from before you. And I will make you a great name, like the name of the great ones of earth." Make you a great name. Where did that come from? Abraham. This part right here also, just as a side note, we'll talk about this a little bit more next week, I think. This is a statement of history. Oftentimes in covenants, you started with the names of the parties and then a brief history of the relationship between the parties. So that's what's going on here. And then he says, "I will appoint a place for my people Israel and will plant them so that they may live in their own place, be disturbed no more, and evildoers shall afflict them no more." All right, so this is the promise. "I will appoint a place for my people Israel and will plant them." Land, where does that harken back to? Abraham. "So that they may live in their own place and be distributed no more, and evildoers shall afflict them no more. As formerly, from the time that I appointed judges over my people Israel, I will give you rest from all your enemies." That right there, it harkens to the blessings of the Sinai covenant. Rest in the land, rest from your enemies. All right. "Moreover, the Lord declares to you that the Lord will make you a house. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your ancestors, I will raise up offspring after you, who shall come forth from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name." So I'm going to make you a house. And that house, of course, meaning a lineage. "But then he shall build a house for my name. I will establish his throne in the kingdom forever. I will be a father to him. He shall be a son to me. When he commits iniquity, I will punish him with a rod such as mortals use, with blows inflicted by human beings. But I will not take my steadfast love from him as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from you. Your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me, and your throne will be established forever." In accordance with all these words and all his vision, Nathan spoke to David. Okay, so the covenant promises. "The Lord declares to you," so that was the oath, "I will raise up a son from your own body." So step number 1, there will be a son. 2, that son will build a house for God. So that the house that David was interested in, not going to be you, David, it's going to be your son. "And I will establish his kingdom forever." Okay, that's a big promise. So this son of yours is going to build the temple, and his kingdom will be forever. I will be a father to him, he will be a son to me. Okay, that's a big one right there. So God basically using adoptionistic language to say that the king of Israel is going to be like a son to God. All right, we'll move on. The king of Israel is going to be God's son. Interesting. And I will never remove my loving kindness from him like happened to Saul. We won't go into that one too much. And your house and kingdom will endure before me forever, and your throne will be established forever. So the line of David will rule in this land forever. Those are the promises. All right. So who are the parties of the covenant? We have David and God. Who's taking the oath? God is. Was there any oath on David's part? I mean, no. In some sense, the covenant isn't even given directly to David. It's given to Nathan to go communicate to David. Is there any contingency, quid pro quo? Is there any if statement? The answer is no. There are no if statements. So what kind of covenant is it? This establishes it as another one of those promissory covenants. And can God fail to keep his promise? No. All right. So that's what we've got here. So how do we sum up the promise? Well, God will have a dwelling place among them, the house. So God will have that temple. God will dwell with his people. This also goes back to one of the culmination of all the blessings in the Sinai covenant. I will walk with you and be your God, and you will be my people. I will walk with you. That's the presence. So this is similar to also the Garden of Eden, when God was dwelling with them in the garden. And there being a place to dwell is kind of a link to the Abrahamic promise as well, that land. So God will dwell with his people. Second, the line of David is going to rule forever. So similar to Abraham, there's eternal possession of the land by David's progeny, but this time they're rulers. And then God will relate to the king like a father to a son. There is a special relationship here between God and his people, and in particular this king. This is similar to that Sinai promise of royal priesthood. All right, so the promises of God. God will never again flood the earth. Creation will not be undone. Human sin won't be solved by wrath or destruction. 2, through the line of Abraham, the whole world will be blessed. So this people has been chosen to be his vessel for revelation and renewal to the world. Promise 3, God will dwell with his people in their land. And promise 4, the line of David is going to rule forever. Okay, but wait, did the line of David rule forever? Well, Jerusalem was sacked and the Israelites went into exile, and they weren't exactly kings when that happened. But didn't God make a promise? Yeah. But Ryan, you told us God's promises can never fail. Yes, I did. So then how? All right, let's go over this. When David was giving the charge to Solomon, when David was dying and he was speaking to his son to take over, Solomon was well aware of this covenant. David was aware of this covenant. Both of them understood that this was, even though it was a guarantee, there were conditions attached to it. You go to 1 Kings 2, David's last words to Solomon. So as for me, I'm going the way of all the earth. Be strong and courageous like a man, and keep your obligation to the Lord your God, to walk in his ways and to keep in his statutes, commands, ordinances, and decrees. This is written in the law of Moses. So that's Sinai, written in the law of Moses, so that you will have success in everything you do and wherever you turn. This, by the way, sounds very much like the words of Joshua, right? Be strong and courageous. Do not step aside from the words of the law to the left or to the right. Keep the book of the law on your lips so that the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go, right? And so that the Lord your God will carry out his promise that he made to me. If your sons are careful to walk faithfully before me in their whole mind and heart, you will never fail to have a man on the throne of Israel. Interesting. So this is the description of David to Solomon, that there actually was an if statement associated. Okay, so there's an if, but there was no oath taken by David that that would happen. So this is what we're calling this is the conditional but guaranteed covenant. This is different than a covenant that would be conditional and not guaranteed. That would be Sinai. There's blessings and curses. Here, God is the only one who's taken the covenant oath. And so that is a lifelong unchangeable agreement. So it will be the case that someone from the line of David will live forever. But individuals can forfeit that lineage through disobedience. So what that means is if an individual forfeits that, then that person may disinherit the promise, but the promise will return through somebody else. Now, Solomon fulfilled part of the covenant. Solomon was a son from David's own body. He did have his kingdom established. He did build a temple for God. All of those things happened. There were other problems, though, right? The kingdom ended up being split between his sons. His throne wasn't established forever. They eventually went into exile. Solomon had, issues with women, and that turned into issues with idolatry. And so the line was not established forever. And so Solomon disinherited some of the promise as a result. And so what we're going to see, and as we'll see next week too, there were multiple covenants between God and the Israelites at this time. The breach of the Sinai covenant necessitated the execution of the covenant curses. So this is, rather than saying the covenant itself was broken, this goes more back to when he does wrong, I will discipline him with a human rod and blows from others. But God still made a promise, and it is still guaranteed. It is guaranteed the line will rule forever because God did promise that. So individuals can forfeit that claim through disobedience. And so God then will bring that back through somebody else. And if you recall, Jesus is called the Son of David. Indeed, he is from the line of David. And Jesus is the eternally reigning king. And there's a whole lot of, proof texting that could get us there that we don't have time for right now. But we can just assume that based on the New Testament theology for right now. So I'm amending this last one to say Yahweh's kings, the line of David, will rule forever, ultimately through Jesus, the Son of David. So these are the promises. God is never going to flood the earth again. Human sin won't be solved by wrath and destruction. Through the line of Abraham, through a chosen people, God will bring blessing to the whole world, and God will dwell with his people, and God will have, it is the Son of God who is going to be ruling over the earth forever. So these are the promises that you see in the Old Testament theology for their covenants. So the last thing I want to get to is, why did God use covenants? He didn't have to. There's nothing that says that God must do it that way. So here's what I'll say. Blessing coming from God in exchange for nothing else. A promissory covenant. This is a fundamentally different relationship between God and people than the great symbiosis. Remember, we've talked about this great symbiosis. I scratch your back, gods. You scratch my back. The labor of the gods was too great, so they made humans. The humans would satisfy their needs, and in exchange, the gods would use their special powers. They'd, bring storms if they were happy, or really bad storms if they were mad. Yahweh entering into covenant with humans and promising things for nothing in return is an enormous difference. This is completely unique amongst the ancient Near East. That doesn't happen. Gods were in a reciprocal relationship. You met my needs and I'll meet yours. Not, I, Yahweh, I, God, am going to just bestow blessing upon you because of the status that I'm giving you as my people, and I desire this relationship with you, and this relationship is going to be the way, it's going to be, how do I put it? You are going to be the co-workers with me on the covenant. So God doesn't have needs that must be met by humans. He's conferring blessing unilaterally. He's working through these people to bless the whole world. So covenants established a relationship between gods and humans, but the nature of that relationship was the invitation to participate in bringing about the purpose of God, not symbiotic. So rather than this great symbiosis, we have this great enterprise that's symbolized by the covenants. So God's covenants make him totally unique from the other gods in the ancient Near East, in that people are vessels through whom blessing is coming to the world, and he's making unilateral promises that don't require reciprocation or sacrifice or anything else that those other gods require. So the covenants are a way to establish his uniqueness, and is operating outside and differently and other, holy would be the word, relative to all the other gods. So that would be, I think, the differentiating marker and why the use of covenant is significant. So that's all for now. That's on the theology of covenants in the Old Testament. I really appreciate you listening. And as always, I hope you come back next week, and God bless.